is a bylaw that regulates how a property is developed in much more detail. And we have a map out in the lobby, and one of the slides will come up that will show it. And you look on the map and it tells you what zone you're in. And then you go to that section of the bylaw, and it's going to list some different rules about how construction can take place on that property. The bylaw also has some general rules that apply to properties across the city, and so there's also rules of that nature. But ultimately, it's a much more detailed type of bylaw than the municipal plan. But it very much helps to implement the policies of the plan, the direction, how we're trying to guide in a particular area of the city to look like in the future. So during the PlanMoncton process, when we looked at the zoning bylaw, there were two key things that we're focusing on. And one is, how do we think about these themes that we've been talking about through PlanMoncton, and what do they mean in terms of the zoning bylaw? And secondly, how do we try to make the zoning bylaw a little easier to use? Because when you look at it, it can be quite a daunting document. How do we try to simplify it and make it easier for folks that have to use the bylaw? In terms of some of the themes we've been looking at through PlanMoncton, that first theme of embracing nature, of thinking of how we can make our city greener, some of the things we've been looking at in the zoning bylaw are the landscaping provisions. The other aspect has to do with the zoning of our parks and open spaces, which we are going through and making sure that those spaces that the city is committed to keeping as parks, that they're properly zoned for parks and open space. In the area of the theme under complete streets, where we were talking about those corridors and key centers of the city and how we design those so that they create a more pedestrian, more transit-oriented environment. We have looked at the creation of a new mixed-use zone. It's a zone that can help on some of these busier streets where you're trying to integrate commercial and residential uses. So we've been looking at that concept, as well as how we design along some of those busier stretches of the city. I mentioned that we're having a look at the planning policy boundaries for downtown. When we look at those kinds of things, we also have to look at how it affects the zoning bylaw and the rules around development and where we apply downtown zones. So if you're interested in that topic, by all means, we have some maps out in the lobby where we're looking at how that change in policy might get reflected in the zoning bylaws. In terms of complete neighborhoods and thinking about how we create some flexibility in our neighborhoods so that we can adapt and allow for some of these changing needs to be supported. We have been looking at how we provide for daycares, the notion of community gardens, the notion of neighborhood centers. How can we ensure that our zoning bylaw can properly allow for those kinds of uses? One of the things we've been focused on as well is trying to make sure that when we are looking at different kinds of housing, that we're also looking at how we integrate different kinds of housing well in neighborhoods, so that we're not necessarily creating conflicts between a building that might be slightly bigger with a smaller building. How do we properly transition and locate and design different kinds of housing so that it actually creates a really nice neighborhood? A little bit on the environmental front here. The city and the tri-community actually as a whole has been undertaking a study to look at climate change, to try to understand climate change. Lots of cities are actually engaged in this kind of work to try to anticipate how climate change might affect things like flood levels of a city. And so that kind of work is underway. We don't have the results of it yet, but it might help to inform us on what some of our minimum floor elevations might need to be in the city. So that's a piece of work that's not quite done, we're not quite there yet, but certainly something that's being looked at. We've talked about and looked at some ways of greening up parking lot areas, particularly large developments where you see quite a lot of parking surface, hard surface, and how we can start designing some of those areas better for aesthetic reasons, but also importantly stormwater reasons, and trying to address climate change. Stormwater management is another topic that we've been looking at in the zoning bylaw as well. The second objective in terms of looking at the zoning bylaw is trying to make it simpler. So one of the things that we've been doing is just trying to make sure that where we're using similar kinds of language between different zones, tidying it up so it's the exact same language, so that there's, we're being very consistent, using less terms that kind of mean the same thing, just trying to simplify it so that it's shorter, really. Also, we're looking at streamlining the number of zones, where we have a couple of zones in the city that are almost identical except for one little thing. Really thinking about whether that really needs to be different or whether there's a way of combining those two zones together so that we're, again, simplifying the whole system a little bit more. And also how we lay out the rules, something as simple as using tables instead of pages and pages and pages of text as a way of just making things easier for the user. So it might look a little different, but hopefully easier to use. This is, you're not going to be able to read this, but this is an example of the zoning map, and as I said, we have copies of this out of the mall. As I did mention that we have been spending some time looking at multiple unit dwellings and looking at different kinds of housing and how we integrate those well into neighborhoods. And so we have been looking at the standards for multiple unit dwellings, and we have some of that information out in the lobby. We've also been looking in particular at the R2 zone. I won't go into the details now, but if you find that you have an interest, there's a pocket of an area of the city that's close to the core that happens to fall within the R2 zone, and our R2U zone rather, and we have been having a look at that. It's a zone that allows for some additional units to be built on properties, and part of the challenge is trying to allow for that adaptation in neighborhoods but still keep the character of the neighborhoods, and that's what we've been looking at. We've been revisiting the rules with that in mind. So certainly if you have an interest in knowing more about that, do come out and we can fill you in on it. Other parts of the bylaw that get looked at, lot requirements, and then there's a whole bunch of schedules to the bylaw. So certainly for those of you that are very familiar with the bylaw, have a direct interest with where that's headed at this point, please come and see us after. Last slide, and this slide has to do with where we're going after tonight and what we do with your feedback. As a committee, we'll be reviewing all the feedback that we get through this stage with the intention of preparing a proposed municipal plan, a proposed zoning bylaw that would be presented to City Council. The municipal plan is a bylaw that's prepared under the Community Planning Act, which lays out a whole course of action for how the bylaws are adopted. So there's a whole formal process that would follow once this is presented to City Council. And and there would be advertisements in the papers with an invitation to come for a public presentation. And after that public presentation, you would have the opportunity to review the documents and provide your feedback to City Council. And then City Council holds a public hearing process to hear from the public before they make their decisions. So all to say that this isn't the last step, that there's another step to follow, which is a more formal step. But certainly, if you ever have questions, you don't have to wait for a PlanMoncton event. You can get in touch with us at any time by giving us a call or coming into the office, and we're more than happy to spend time and talk about your ideas or your concerns. And that concludes my update. On behalf of the committee, we really thank you for coming. And at this stage, I'd like to just open it up. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask myself or the committee, I'd be more than happy to answer.